This is the lecture for Unit 1, Module 1, Com 431, Applied Business and Professional Communication, entitled Communication Competence in a Demanding Workplace. What does the workplace demand? According to the National Association of Colleges and Employers 2011 survey, in which executives in 244 different businesses were asked to rate candidate skills and qualities, this top 10 list of the most desired qualities was result. First, most important quality to employers is a candidate's ability to work within a team structure, to work with other people. Second is the ability to verbally communicate with individuals who are inside the organization as well as with people outside the organization. The third most desired quality is the ability to make decisions and solve problems. Fourth, the ability to obtain and process information. The fifth most desired quality is the ability to plan, organize, and prioritize one's work, followed by the ability to analyze quantitative, that is, numerical counting data. Seventh, employers were looking for candidates who had technical knowledge related to the job, and you might think that that would be the most important qualification, but clearly employers see it differently. Eighth, employers rated an individual's proficiency with computer software programs as being a highly desired quality. Ninth was the ability to create and or edit written reports. And finally, the 10th most desired quality is the ability to sell or influence other people. Now, as you can see, I've highlighted the characteristics or the qualities that are related in some specific way to communication, and it's easy to see quickly that more than half of the top 10 qualities involve a person's ability to communicate. You need to be able to communicate to deal with members of work teams and work groups. Verbal communication inside and outside the organization is going to require different skills depending on who you're talking to. Having the ability to make decisions and solve problems involves having the ability to gather the information you need, process that information, engage in dialogue with other individuals, and to make decisions. The ability to obtain and process that information also requires us to be able to communicate. Obviously, creating and or editing written reports is a heavy communication skill, as or is the ability to sell or influence other people. Now, as we've seen, communication skills are highly valued by employers, and this is one of the main reasons why we think it's important to study applied business and professional communication while you're still in a university setting. Communication is just so important. Now, Muller and Craig wrote a textbook that is sort of the standard when we think about communication theory. And one of the things that they wrote that I really like is this statement that the way we think and talk about communication affects how we communicate. The way we communicate affects how we think about communication. And we tend to think about communication when we encounter communication problems. So if I talk about communication and say, well, it's not all that terribly important or is only for some people, chances are pretty good that I'm not going to put the kind of effort into being an excellent communicator. And as you've seen from the previous slides, that excellence in communication really is highly valued by employers. Another quote that I really like that kind of summarizes this idea is the fact that George Bernard Shaw wrote, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." And so what we want to talk about next is sort of what is communication. The quick and easy definition of communication is perhaps that it's a complex or a challenging process. But you'll notice that when we talk about a process, we're not talking about something that just happens one time and then is complete. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about communication. Everything that happens in communication is part of a long process that involves much more than simply talking. In general, communicators face three very important challenges as they attempt to create a sense of shared meaning with the people that they're speaking with. The first challenge is that different communicators vary in the amount of communication skill that they have, in their capability, and in how comfortable they feel communicating. Some people are comfortable communicating interpersonally, one-on-one with one other person, but very uncomfortable, for example, giving a public address. Others of us actually like to speak in public, but feel a little bit awkward when we're placed in a room with a stranger. So our communication skill varies from situation to situation, and our level of comfort also varies. A second challenge is that we can think everything's going great, but at any point during the communication process, we can encounter communication problems. And finally, these communication problems can be particularly pronounced in business settings where we're often dealing with multiple audiences and multiple challenges at the same time. The communication process has been described in a variety of different ways, but the basic process can be understood using something that we call the linear model of communication. Basically, according to your textbook, we can think of this linear model as having 5 stages. The first is that the sender, the person on the left who's holding the bow and arrow, they decide that they want to send a message. And in this little illustration here, I would think of the arrow as the message. The sender encodes intended meanings of the message, so they decide what words to use, what nonverbal signs or signals to send along with those words. Next, the sender transmits this information as communication, as some kind of information. And often they do this using a communication channel, such as face-to-face, email, use of online social networks, the telephone, printed matter, mediated communication such as radio or TV. Once the message has been transmitted, then it's time for the receiver to get in on the game. They perceive the information that's incoming as a message that's being sent by the sender, and once that is perceived as a message, the receiver goes ahead and decodes and then interprets that message. Of course, the interpretation can be the challenging part of communication because language is largely symbolic. In other words, the connections between words and the ideas or things that they represent is arbitrary. So if we look at this slide, you see a picture of some sort of fish on a string, something that looks like a nice meal, and something that looks like a medieval knight's shield. Well, the fish on a string and the knight's shield are both referred to by the word kite, which is not typically the word that we would use to describe these items. The item in the middle might be referred to as a taco, but if you speak Japanese, the fish on the left are actually taco because that's the Japanese word for kite. So can you see how confusing this can be? In other words, it's very important to remember that just because someone has used a word, this does not mean that the meaning that is intended by the use of that word is necessarily the meaning that I'm going to understand. It's a complicated process. In fact, meaning is very, very subjective. Often our interpretations are really related to our past experiences. So if you look at that picture on our slide again, it looks like a report card. For many of you, just the word report card can have a really negative connotation. Perhaps it reminds you of the test that you failed in elementary school, or that important science class that you just couldn't do better than a C. And so getting the report card was often a negative time. What this means is that sometimes when people use the word report card, it might have a negative meaning for the people who are listening to the use of that word. For others, report card was a happy time when you collected from mom and dad. So for those people, the use of report card might not be such a problem. But can you see how a person who loved report cards could talk about report cards for a person who really hated them? And the two of them would have a very different meaning that they might attach to that word report card. So while at first glance it seems a fairly simple thing to choose a message and send it through a communication channel to a receiver, a better way of thinking about communication is to recognize that it is both simultaneous and interactive. So if you look at this model, you can see that instead of simply having a sender and a receiver, we identify these individuals as communicators because both individuals send and receive messages. In fact, it's that feedback loop that makes communication interactive. Now in this image we can also see that each of the individuals that is communicating in this environment brings along with them their own background, their own communication environment, if you will. The message still travels through communication channels, but it's often interrupted by noise that can come from either individuals' background, their experiences, even the particular situation that they're in at the moment. So it's that feedback that transforms the linear model of communication into something that we might refer to as a simultaneous transactions model. There's a lot going on. Now in the business and professional world, the complex process of communication is made even more complex because it's important for us to develop an understanding of what's appropriate in the business setting. We need to understand the organizational norms. For example, if you look at this image, it looks like people wear suits to work. That doesn't happen in every organizational setting. But if you were to wear a suit in a place where people show up in khaki slacks, you'd be way overdressed. Alternately, if you showed up in your khaki slacks with this particular business organization, you might be seen in a negative light. So it's important for a communicator in a business world to spend a certain amount of time and put forth some effort to analyze people, tasks, and situations skillfully. Even those who know what's appropriate and who've done a good job analyzing people, tasks, and situations will also need to have some key communication skills going forward. Some of these skills include the skillful ability to listen, the ability to offer individuals eye contact. Communication skills in interviewing are going to be really important. That's why we have an interviewing assignment in this class. Persuasion is a key communication skill in the business world, and public speaking is valued in many different kinds of business settings. Perspective taking and empathy are important, as is conversation management, global and intercultural communication, and skillful use of communication technology. Of course, we'd all like our communication to go smoothly and our meanings to be understood easily, but the reality is that lots of things can go wrong in business communication. Just a short list includes things like mindless messaging. Have you ever received a message from someone when it was really obvious that they hadn't been paying close attention when they were sending it? Often business communication poses some real ethical dilemmas that we need to solve, and some communication situations can test your ethical boundaries. Many business communicators operate from a position of selfishness, so that self-interest can really be a hindrance to effective communication with some people. Communication apprehension or just feeling uncomfortable in some communication situations can be a problem in business communication, as can pure incompetence. Ineffective use of new media is another one, and this is a big problem in business settings today. And finally, a lack of motivation can really get in the way of effective communication. Now, one challenge that is increasingly faced by business and professional communicators is the challenge associated with doing business in a global economy. Global business requires communicators to have skill not only communicating in their own cultural context, but increasingly people are required to communicate with individuals from a variety of different cultures and understand those cultural contexts as well. And a final challenge that I want to address today is the challenge that comes with the digital world in which we now find ourselves. Stress, burnout, and information overload can be seen as both a cause and an effect of digital communication. So increasing numbers of people are finding that the inability to disconnect from the web, from the various sources of communication technology that keep them connected, can actually be a source of stress and overload. I read a magazine article just the other day about executives who were increasingly choosing to take vacations where they disconnect completely from the grid, leave their cell phones and their iPads at home so that they can get away from the constant, almost tyranny of the communication technology that surrounds us. Of course, on the other hand, it is that very communication technology that helps us to manage our information more easily and to avoid some of the stressors that maybe came from a lack of communication in the past. So we'll be addressing this digital challenge as we continue this semester.